A learning organization is one that is constantly looking at ways to evolve and understand their position in the environment. We need to build that psychological safety into the system so that basically someone can say, I've just done this and I think I made a real bit of a mess up, and not and that person not feel that they're going to be fired for doing that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
actually an opportunity to learn from this experience. Security comes from being creative, and you need to be able to build that creativity into your teams and not build up technical debt and be proud of what they're delivering. Everyone's entitled to have pride in their work. If we take that away from people, then they're not really developing.
Welcome to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm your host, Mike Jones, and today I'm joined by Glenn Wilson, a cybersecurity leader and system thinker. This isn't just a tech conversation. We explore how the strategic challenges of cybersecurity mirror those in execution, alignment, capability, and learning under pressure. From technical debt to OODA loops, this is about building resilient organisations where security and strategy go hand in hand. Welcome back to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. Today I am delighted to be joined by Glenn Wilson. We first met on LinkedIn. I think I seem to meet most of my guests on LinkedIn. It's just a good way to meet guests. But Glenn, it's great to have you on.
Hi, Mike. Pleasure to be here.
Just for our listeners, can you please provide a bit of background, a bit of context about what you've been up to lately?
Yeah, sure. I'm Glenn Wilson. I'm predominantly a cybersecurity consultant, freelance consultant, so I don't work for any of the big companies. I've been in cybersecurity for a number of years, although my progression, as no one maps out a career into cybersecurity. It's just incidental. So I started off many years ago as a market researcher. That evolved into crunching numbers. Crunching numbers meant writing code. Writing code then turned into more of a security slant on it as the code became much more important to my clients. When you're writing code that goes into chip and pin devices, for example, or healthcare and stuff like that. So security became a thing for me, and over time I evolved into somebody more attuned to the leadership security. So how do leaders integrate security into what they're doing, as opposed to being hands-on with the developers and showing them how to do security. I'm much more around the strategy of it. I'm currently doing a master's in systems thinking in practice as well at the Open University, and my dissertation is also taking a focus on cybersecurity from a holistic, systemic point of view.
Oh, cool. And for the listeners, they're probably thinking, like, there's a strategy show and we talk about strategy and execution. They're probably wondering why we've got a cybersecurity expert on. But I think, from conversations we've had, there's a lot of commonality between the challenges that you have as a leader in cybersecurity or trying to help organisations and leaders in cybersecurity to the challenges we face in executing strategy across an organisation. So, from that point, let's explore those commonalities. What are the challenges do you feel that, with cybersecurity in organisations?
I think the main challenge we're facing at the moment, and I'm going to say it, we don't have a strategy. We don't know what we're doing. So with some of the clients I work with, you have strategies for certain parts of security. So there might be, and when I say strategy, I really mean policy. I think strategy and policy are closely linked. So when you think about a policy for doing code scanning, for example, to identify vulnerabilities, it could be a policy or strategy around how you manage vulnerabilities. And then if you go into the incident management, what's your strategy for dealing with incidents? And we don't really seem to have a good way of doing this at the moment. And that's borne out by some of the reports we're seeing coming out. So for example, the data breach reports show that we're seeing more incidents than ever before. The cost of incidents is rising. More companies are being affected by data breaches. So effectively, we're not doing a great job of cybersecurity. And I think it boils down to the fact that we're stuck in a paradigm. We're stuck in some sort of way of doing stuff that doesn't quite work out, which is sort of one of the essence of my dissertation really is, why are we doing things in a way that just doesn't seem to be bearing fruit? And I'll give you an example, vulnerability management. We quite often see developers develop software with vulnerabilities inside that code, and that vulnerability needs to be prioritized and potentially fixed if it's considered a problem. But we have this conflict between the security priorities and the priorities of the business. And it can be quite difficult to balance those out. So what happens is we're delivering features, we're delivering products faster and faster and faster. So we're building up more and more technical debt, and that technical debt is much more aligned to the security challenges we're facing at the moment because we're creating vulnerable code, we're not fixing it, we develop more code on top of that vulnerable code, and then eventually, we end up with a data breach. We end up with a situation where an attacker's been able to get into our systems and either compromise our whole business by a ransomware attack or stolen data or weaponized our company against someone else or something. So it is a challenge, and there doesn't seem to be a clear, cohesive strategy about how we defend against this type of attack, and that's borne out, as I said, by the numbers that we're seeing.
Yeah. Now, that's the interesting challenge you find is that tension. I think it's that tension between, let's look at very short term and let's get this stuff out, but they're not then, balancing that with the future risks around looking at, well, what's going to happen? How's that going to constrain us in the future? And I think that short-termism, I think it's become really challenging for organizations.
Yeah, definitely. Again, that's a massive tension, isn't it? The short term versus the long term. We are trying to develop products at a higher cadence. And I'll come on to DevOps and DevSecOps in a moment, a topic that I've written about. But the whole idea is that we want to deliver features faster. Not every team does that. A lot of teams develop code over a period of time and then release something. And what happens then is they accumulate technical debt because although the release cycle is, say, every 6 months, within those 6 months or 1 year, whatever that release cycle is, the slower cadence, they're still developing code that's accumulating debt. Maybe the testing isn't up to scratch and so forth, because again, there's pressures from the business that we haven't got time to do testing. We just need to get that piece into the final release, and they keep on building that way. Yeah, and so whether you're doing DevOps and DevSecOps or agile development, where you're working at a higher cadence, so you're delivering, say, daily or multiple times a day, or perhaps even just once a week, you're still accumulating debt because we've got this speed of delivery, and it doesn't matter which methodology you're using, you end up in this strange situation where you're accumulating security debt, and it's quite worrying because these linger, and attacks happen long way down the line, affecting code that was written many years ago, and those developers have moved on, they've forgotten their code, so who's going to come along and fix them?
Just a quick one, just to go back on it. What are you calling technical debt? What does that mean to businesses?
Technical debt is a good one. I've got a friend who actually doesn't like to call it technical debt. He likes to call it business debt. So technical debt is where you have code, so talking about software, let's say, we have code that's been written in a way that was really to get the feature out. So we've missed some checks and balances within the code. So maybe error handling hasn't been dealt with properly. The code needs to flow to a nice ending, but sometimes we leave that ending out. If the application fouls, we don't know what's going to happen. It's unknown because the developer hasn't written it. So that's a technical debt piece because the developers miss something out, not because they want to, but because they've been, they're just under time pressures, and it's those types of bits of code that's easy to miss out. Or they've written something for, say, a proof of concept, or they've written something very quickly just to show that they can do something, and they've written it in a much more loose, relaxed way, not so many checks and balances again, and then they release that into production, and again, you've accumulated that technical debt because now production contains code that really shouldn't have been in production. And that means that you end up with this security debt. And the reason why I've heard it called business debt is because it's the business driving this prioritization. And so really it's a debt to the business. It shouldn't be considered a debt that the developers need to sort out. It's a debt that the business needs to sort out.
Yeah, because when it goes wrong, the whole business is going to suffer, because that's going to then obviously lead to a breach, probably lead to fines from the information security officers and stuff like that. But it's interesting, what's driving that debt? Is it because the leaders that are making the decisions, that are setting the timelines, are they disconnected between what it actually takes? That's a challenge in business, especially just generally in business. But when you start to get to more technical stuff like coding, and that is not something that you just, can just get a handle on. Go down the shop floor, get a couple of briefs with the lads and, ladies, around what's going on, and then you go back up to make decisions. There's a lot to it. And I think that's a big disconnect that happens, that my worldview about what it takes to develop this product and this code is probably disconnected with the reality of the coders that have got the time pressure to deliver this. And that time pressure can amount to what seemingly upstairs may just seem like is a bit of a missing bit of code. But that missing bit of code could be a vulnerability that could cause massive ramifications. Like, just got to look at what Co-op and Marks and Spencers have had. That was huge, millions and millions, and that's been generous about the cost to recover that breach.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a supply chain issue there as well. So it wasn't so much they were breached, it was a supplier that was breached that, that had implications at either end of the supply chain. Farmers weren't able to get their produce to the shops quick enough because the supply chain was broken. And of course, Marks and Spencer, the Co-op, weren't able to sell the stuff because that stuff wasn't coming through to the shops. So and that shows the impact of just one line of code perhaps being wrong. But yeah, this disconnect, it is a challenge, and I see this all the time. Developers seem to sit in this siloed area. They develop their code, and it's a mysterious area of the company. Nobody really knows what goes on there. But these developers are under pressure. Their business is constantly trying to develop new features, new code, new products all the time. It's like harks back to Taylorism, that these developers, what we do is we know how many lines of code they can write. So it's like, it's like Taylor going through with these like stopwatch, how many lines of code can you write in a day? Well, okay, we'll give them a few more lines of code because they don't seem to be fitting the whole 8 hours. Let's say, let's give them more, And I think they end up in that situation. But coding is, as any developer knows, it's a really difficult thing to do. You're piecing together lots of different pieces of code from other places. You've got abstract knowledge that you're trying to work out how it's going to work. What does the business want? You've got to test it with the users to make sure that you're actually delivering something the users can actually work with. So yeah, it's very difficult to align those two, and especially if you don't have that technical background. You literally are looking at a mysterious black box where they're just these special people are building stuff. But they're not building it quick enough. Let's send them some more stuff down anyway, because they're wonderful people. And yeah, so I think that is a difficult challenge to meet, I think.
Yeah, you brought a good point there about getting in the black box. I have to talk about this with people around. I think we're too quick to try and jump into that black box and start to interfere. And that's where we limit the decision space, especially in coders. That decision space is that space to be able to do what you want them to do, where you can avoid getting into the black box by understanding what inputs do they need, what are the outcomes that they should be producing, especially the inputs in this thing. I often think in leadership, you've been studying system thinking, you think about viable systems models. The inputs are really important, but I think they're overlooked. I think the inputs for what these people, be it coders or anyone in the organization, needs to enact decisions, to develop things, are often overlooked, and they're the first things that get taken away. But we still expect the outcome to be exactly the same.
Yeah. That's what boils down to tooling. So if we think about a business, I've been using the word business quite a bit, but business is really anything that's non-development. And I think about, say, purchasing team. The purchasing team will say, we're going to purchase this software that our developers can use, so certain IDEs or whatever, and they feed that into the developers, but they really had no. It's usually cost-based. It's usually what is the best deal we can get from a vendor so that we can give to our developers. And that comes down to security tooling as well. And there's no interaction with the developers to say, what do you use? How do you use it? How can you use it? What would you like to do to improve the security of your products that you're developing? What we tend to be is much more prescriptive as business people and say, we're going to buy this because it's the cheapest deal. We've got to deal with this vendor, and you're going to use these tools, and it is multiple tools as well. And the tools aren't really fit for purpose for what they're trying to do to developers. So you end up with this input that's wrong, and therefore the outcome is going to be a little less. Is it going to be more? I don't know. It's going to be you're not going to see an output that you're expecting. Let's put it that way. You're going to see, and also developers are going to take more time to learn these tools or try to work around some of the the code. When they're doing the coding, they might not be able to do the stuff they want to do, this particular type of IDE or whatever. So or is a new language that they need to learn. And it's a challenge for them to work out how to use these tools, and so that input doesn't quite work.
No.
and then the output is not the same. And also the instructions of what to build. There's this element sometimes, and I've seen this, where developers are sort of given that freedom to build what they think they should build, but developers aren't really, they're not people that engage with the users that frequently. I know the Agile Manifesto and the Agile movement were trying to change that back in 2000, 2001, but we don't really do that in business. I don't really see that very much, especially in large organizations. You end up having like a product owner or a business analyst in the old days telling you, the developer, what to develop. And that might be wrong. That might not be the right thing to develop. But developers go ahead and develop it anyway, and the output's not quite what the initial intention was. And so we go back to that technical debt again. We build up debt because we're now producing something that the users don't want.
Yeah.
So input and output, very important. They correlate. So is it rubbish in, rubbish out?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's a good point. You brought up two really useful things there. One is about the involvement of the people at the edges of the organisation that are actually doing this stuff. They are the experts because they're the ones that are doing it, and they are using it. We need to make sure that they've got the right tools to do the job. That's something to reflect on for leaders that are listening. How often do we engage with those people when these decisions are made about what tools we use? So I know there is a tension about cost, but that's the conversation. That's the whole point of the conversation. Here's the success criteria, what we're trying to get at. Now, here's the options. Let's find, I always say, the least worst option, because there's never a perfect option, but it's the least worst option that balances the need of the people at the front line and also the business need to, normally a financial constraint or, a policy constraint that they've got. But that's a good one to, reflect on. How often do we actually involve those people that are using it day to day in those decision making? And the other one is around that, that connection with the customer and the user. I know, because the Agile Manifesto was all about that, getting closest to customers as possible. Sometimes that isn't, but if it isn't, then how do we handle that constraint? How do we enable that coordination so that we're not wasting our time providing value that no one wants? The whole point of a business is to provide value that people want, and they want to pay for it, and they love that experience. They're going to carry on coming back. Not if someone wants a Ferrari and we give them a Skoda, it's not going to work.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the word value there, and that's an important concept in security, right? Because how do you measure the value of security? And I think that's very difficult, because is it the value of not being breached? If you've got a secure system and it's not breached, or is it the value that you're delivering to your customer in terms of, we are a secure company, there's a lower risk of your data being stolen if you work with us or use our products? What is the value to the business? Because a lot of it seems to be quite abstract. Like you're building value on something that might not happen.
Well, yeah. This is the problem around risk and innovation, along with cybersecurity. When you're talking to organisations about this, it's getting that tension between today and tomorrow. Really, the future is that I could do this for you, and we could potentially make you safer in the long term. But they're like, well, but it's going to cost this. They're like, oh no, it's all about efficiency. I suppose it's a bit like that Taylorism. It's all about efficiency. Let's try and get as efficient as possible. And it's a hard sell. And often when things are struggling, the first things that go are stuff like cybersecurity, innovation, all those things that are going to support them, either protect them or enable them to adapt in the long term. Yeah, so it's it's interesting to think what leaders actually consider the value of stuff like cybersecurity and innovation really is.
Yeah, it is difficult, and you quite often hear that cybersecurity is a cost to the business, and so rather than a value. So there's been a round of redundancies across a number of organisations that I've been involved with over the years, and quite often the security teams are the ones that seem to be struggling to hold on to their numbers, even though there's it's been well documented that there's a huge imbalance between the number of security people and the number of developers and engineers. And I see that now with some of my clients. You're looking at, say 30 developers looking after 30 security engineers looking after 1,000 or 10,000 developers. And that ratio is just doesn't scale,
No.
So what we're doing to try and close that gap. So there's another one as well, which we struggle with, and again it boils down to that whole idea of value, doesn't it? What is the value of a security engineer if it's a cost?
But then
So, yeah.
then you've got the I suppose the perceived comfort of governance. When
Yes.
you, definitely
Okay.
in security, you've got governance like you've got for cyber world, you've got ISO 27001. That's a joy of being through that myself. But then there's that perceived thing of governance. Well, we've got ISO 27001, we must be fine. But and I think in the same cybersecurity world as the same in strategy execution, it always come down to common. You've got humans involved in that system, which I don't think they account for.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't account for the complexity, right? ISO 27001 is a checkbox exercise. It's a static piece of paper essentially with some questions, but it's trying to keep it's trying to measure a dynamic system with lots of complexities, and that system's changing all the time, which is the reason why you see companies that are 27001 compliant and being breached, because it's not really fit for purpose. Now, my feeling about compliance and such as 27001, and there are others, is that if you follow what they're asking you to do, then you are building some element of security into it, but it's not the be all and end all. It is a start. It's a starting point. And yeah, if you check the boxes, you can give it to the auditors and they'll say you're 27001 compliant, but that is where you start from. The next, it's about like learning a car. You drive a car, you learn how to drive the car with an instructor, but actually you don't really start learning to drive a car properly until after you've passed your tests. You're out in the real world driving on your own and dealing with all those different situations that you've never seen before. That's how you learn, and it's exactly the same thing I think in this case, in this situation as well. So yeah,
I suppose it's that balance between compliance and quality, isn't it? So I can be very compliant, but do I really have the quality around that? Are my and I suppose this comes back to thinking around stuff like Adam's third law. With risk, the more we centralize risk, the more we create risk across the system because we're trying to control it, and we try and control it with policies, processes, strict rules, where actually it's the opposite that you need is actually develop the people to understand and being aware of the challenges you've got to enable them to think. It's not to limit their decision space, is actually to increase the capacity for decisions, which is going to help us in the long term.
Definitely. That's exactly, how I try to talk to my clients is saying, using the words enablement and empowerment, but that's what it is. It's giving the developers the ability to make their decisions and know that they're making good decisions and right decisions. And that autonomous way of working is again, we're going back to the Agile Manifesto. That was what that was trying to do as well. Try to build a ability of autonomy into the development lifecycle. And DevOps has done the same when you integrate operations and developers into the same type of structure. So having that autonomy is good, but I guess also you need cohesion. You need to be a cohesive organization. Otherwise, you're going to end up with like chaos. People doing all their own autonomy. So you do need some sort of element of alignment to some degree between these different teams to make sure that they are doing the right thing and following the right process. I know you were in the army or the military, and there's this thing about commander's intent, and I think that's the same sort of thing we're looking at here. Developers need to know what is the intention of what we're trying to do here. What do we really want to try to deliver, rather than having this prescriptive nature of what's happening right now. So yeah, definitely it is something that needs to be looked at. But
you get it with exactly what we're talking about, in a sense. The commander's intent's really crucial because that's what enables initiative, enables autonomy. Without it, then choices are endless. There's no sort of scaffolding or cognitive framework to then be able to go, well, what have I been asked to do and what's the situation saying and how do I adapt from that? But my fear is that I think we do need coherence of you, because I talk about that anyway, that that we have some sort of structure to enable us to bring us together, but we've got to be mindful with things like ISO 27001. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, by the way. I think it's good. It provides that, like you said, but there is a risk that you go from removing thinking from people, and then people become stupid in the system, not because they are stupid, but it's because they walk through the door and they're not allowed to make decisions. It's all done by policy. The policy said that, or the rule says that. There's no sort of
learning or understanding around that, rather than seeing something like ISO 27001 as a, as the coherent thing. This is the minimum thing we're going for. If we have this, it gives us enough structure to know roughly how we sort of organize it, but we do need to provide that space for people to have good understanding of the context and to actually make decisions and know why they're making those decisions.
Exactly.
I think that makes you more, because you said earlier that the cyber world in the real world is dynamic. If it's dynamic, then we need thinkers. If it's not dynamic and we're in a factory, then you could probably get away with a bit of high division of labor and a bit of hierarchical policy.
Yeah. There's another side to security as well, which we haven't really touched about. We talked about like the preventative side of security, which is about writing good products in the first place. But there's also that whole side of defensive security and how do we protect ourselves when there is an incident, when our code does get breached, and that's another area that is a challenge for a lot of organizations at the moment. And hence the reason why, again, as I say, you see a lot of companies being affected by ransomware, and there are some parachutes, which is like, there's security insurance, and people pay enough money into security insurance, and that requires some sort of compliance to some sort of standard like ISO 27001 to show that you are doing security. But we have insurance to help us get through that. But actually, that's a cheap way of doing it, really. What we should be doing is looking at, how do we build resilience into our organizations so that if we are breached or there is a problem, we know how to deal with it. And I think that's an area that there hasn't been much work on at the moment, and we're not really exploring that as much as we should do. There is a concept for something called security chaos engineering. It was actually created years ago. Chaos engineering was created years ago at Netflix. A friend of mine, Aaron Reinhardt, took it further to security chaos engineering, and Kelly Shortridge wrote a good book with him on it as well. But that's about building that resilience. So security chaos engineering is a bit like, I guess, the red teaming in a military context.
Oh, yeah.
So red teaming in security context is like loads of what we call white hat hackers. They're internal hackers. They try to find like holes in your code, and then you fix those you fix that code or you fix that product. Yeah. And that's what red teaming has become in the security world. But I believe in the world of military, red teaming is about scenario training. So training for different scenarios. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what security chaos engineering is about. It's about creating the resilience to say, well, if this were to happen, this type of thing were to happen, how would we get around it? And let's build that into our system so that we can get around it. We can actually overcome it. Netflix gave a really good example of that when they first started out with chaos engineering, when the whole of the Eastern AWS board went down, and they were able to carry on streaming, and no one else was able to do what they wanted to do. Their business were badly affected. People said, well, how do you do that? And that's when the whole idea of chaos engineering came out. And that is that they built that resilience into their system so that they could actually deal with it. And that's, I see the same thing should happen with security. As I say, there is a good book on it at the moment, but we don't practice it enough. And I don't know why we don't practice it, because it just seems like the right thing to do in my mind. I've been talking about security chaos engineering for a long time, but scenario building, scenario training, and helping developers or incident managers actually understand what could happen and how they get around it.
Yeah, I think that's crucial, because I was looking at people about red teaming to come on the show, and I got Marcus Dimbleby, he came on. But it's quite difficult because when you now talk about red teaming to people, it's almost lost its original idea, and it's now the cyber version of it, which is, like you said, it's like, well, I'm going to test, around the edges, and you're going to fix that, rather than what it should be, which is really going through testing things. What if this happens? Start simulating these problems and learn from it. There's a guy I had on here called Don Vandergriff. He's a great guy, and he talks about outcome-based learning, which is exactly that. It's about let's think of a problem. This scenario is probably plausible, and put people under pressure to think about what would you do in that situation. And it's not about having a definitive answer. It's the same in the military. We don't do this stuff to say, yeah, we've got the answer to everything. What we do it for is so that when an incident happens, we're not suddenly exploiting all our cognitive capacity trying to think about how we do with it. We're building enough scaffolding to make decisions. So we know that, well, what happens if we get a casualty here? We won't predict exactly how it's going to be, but it's enough so that people know what they're doing. They can just get on with it. And the leaders then, and everybody else, still got that spare capacity to look forward and go, right, okay, now we're dealing with that. What's next?
Yeah.
and it makes them more adaptable in there. And I think that's probably really useful.
Yeah.
Definitely
I
in your
actually
world.
love this. I really do love this because I think this is the essence of what security is about, really.
Mm,
It's about having that adaptability. We're trying to be too prescriptive in what we're doing, but
mm,
we're dealing with a threat landscape that's changing all the time. I mean, 10 years ago, there was no such thing as ransomware. Now we've got AI and we've got new threats appearing there. And,
yeah.
it's a constantly changing landscape, and we need to be able to adapt to that and adapt to the different types of threats that are going to affect us, and how we actually deal with those threats. Because we're always going to write vulnerable software. We're always going to write develop vulnerable products. It's never going to be 100% like, secure. But what we need to be able to do is build that resilience into organizations so that when there is a breach, we dealt with that. That's good.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
And and you
Yeah,
saw the two different responses recently with
yeah,
Marks and Spencer and Co-op. Now, I think both struggled with that adaptiveness about what to do, but I think Co-op were a bit bolder in their decisions, and they just decided to take the hit and they shut all their systems off,
mm,
disconnected it completely and dealt with it, which meant that they had nothing. They literally had to shut everything down, and they isolated it and dealt with it, which in the long term was quicker, because where Marks and Spencers, they tried to almost like fight through it, and it just kept dragging on and dragging on and
mm.
dragging on, which I think caused them more issues than probably just being a bit more decisive and saying, right, let's just cut it and move on. I don't know which was right or wrong, because I'm not really in that world, but it's quite
No.
interesting to see two different responses to a similar situation.
Yeah, definitely both were reactive, but one obviously decided that, this is a situation that perhaps the best way forward is to just stop. Let's see what's going on and then rebuild from there. It sounds to me that Marks and Spencers were trying to be resilient, but didn't really have that capacity to be resilient.
Yeah.
So yeah, essentially, yeah, I like those two different views of the same. It was the same incident more or less, but different ways of dealing with it. Yeah, it is an interesting area, and as you said earlier, it's not just about showing people how to do something when something happens. It's more about building that condition into people's, like, so it's conditioning. And
Yes.
I like to use the example of the fire brigade. So the fire brigades, they go through these drills daily, about how to, people that have cars, how to deal with fires, how to lots of different scenarios that they practice. But every incident they go to will be unique, and they would never have seen something exactly the same as that. It might be similar, but they might have different casualties. They might have someone trapped in a car in a different way. Fire might have, the fire might be developing in ways that they couldn't have imagined, and putting people at risk. And how they deal with that, as you said, they had that capacity to know what to do because it's been trained in them. It's become more of a behavioral instinct as opposed to having to think about what they need to do. And I think cybersecurity could learn from that. We could definitely learn from that. How do we, build that resilience into our organization so that when there is a cyber attack, we can deal with it. We know what to do. We may not necessarily have seen that exact attack before, but we know what to do, or at least try some stuff out that could work. But
I
yeah,
know
that's
I forgot. I don't know what organisation it is now, but it's something to do with Cyber World, and they provide like tabletop exercises
yeah,
that you can download. I'm going to say the NCA, but that's not it. It's not that, but it's something. But often with those things, they're good, but they're not. They're not context specific. I think if you really want to get the value, you need to have something that's really context
yeah,
specific to
yeah,
yours. And also, what I've seen, with tabletop exercises and stuff like that, what you tend to have is you've got leadership, and the leadership are doing it.
yeah,
Where the point with the fire service and the military is that everyone's involved, and I'm not going, well, you're now going to do this. I
yeah,
say to the people there, well, like I said, the thing, we have a casualty at this point, and I just point to something and go, what do we do?
yeah,
Because it's not in those situations. It cares very little what I think, because I'm not the one doing it. And I
yeah,
don't have the capacity to direct everyone in those situations, because we just wouldn't have that. So I need people, have the confidence that people have assimilated that are actually going to do it. So we go, we've had, I'm very, I'm not really a technical person, but we've got a, threat in this server, to that, well, what would you do? Well, have we done that? Then I need to do this, 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 and this. Okay, but what impact would that have on that team?
Yeah.
And you point to the team, you go, well, that means this to us, so we'd probably need to do this. Okay, cool. How would you communicate that? It's that real get into that detail about how do you do those things. So when we actually go ahead and do it, I know things will not run smoothly, because it never does, but it'll run a lot more smoother than me having to personally direct every step of that situation, because you're just reliant on one person, and that's not a good place to be.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned tabletop exercises as well there, and tabletop exercises, in my experience, once a year activities.
Yeah.
And they usually involve a whole bunch of people that would not really be involved in an incident, really. As you say, there'd be lots of managers there. As I say, the fire services train daily, they drill daily, and I guess the military train daily, they drill daily, so they can deal with this. But yeah, it's
and we teach people outcome-based learning. It's really simple. You literally do it in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And I think that's it. It's like after-action reviews in organisations. They're done like once a year or after a major incident when something goes wrong, but they're just not practiced consistently throughout the year. So you're not learning. You're only learning when something goes wrong. And it's wrong. And that's the same with this resilience. You're only doing it because, all right, we need to now demonstrate to the ISO people that we've done a tabletop exercise, rather than, and I think that's the essence of what you're trying to talk about cyber, and I'm talking about in strategy, is that we do things because it's almost scripted to do things, rather than doing things because underlying that's the activity that's going to help you through any of these situations.
Yeah, I don't know whether you've worked in any organisations and they've said to you, right, before you start here, you need to do this 20-minute test that shows that you're cybersecurity aware.
Yeah.
And then we'll come back to you in about a year's time and teach you this again. That's not a learning organisation. A learning organisation is one that can, is constantly looking at ways to evolve and understand, their position in the environment. You mentioned also communication. Communication is so important. The communication between departments, between certain roles within an organisation. It's so important to have that communication, because that's also where you learn as well. It's, how can we build more resilience into what we're doing? Work collaboratively to do that. And then another communication channel which is very important is understanding when internally something's not quite right, and you need to act on it quickly, so that you're not going to leave yourself open. How many times have we heard of breaches where no one knows what's actually going on until a couple of days later, and they say, "Oh, damn, I think we've been breached."
Yeah.
It quite happened. There was a very sophisticated cybersecurity attack on our systems. It was just a ransomware attack that some kiddie probably sent off to their servers and got in through some phishing attack. So yeah.
And that's that feedback loop, isn't it? Rarely they're closed. That trust that people can, speak up and say, I think something's happened here, rather than, I often think a lot of this stuff in organisations, in the cyber world, in the security world, just generally in organisations, it's the fear that I've done something wrong. Oh, I've clicked that, I shouldn't have done that. Oh, I'm going to try and keep quiet, rather than just open up to it. People are going to make mistakes. Yeah, we can learn from it.
And you hear that with phishing simulation. So phishing attack is where someone has sent an email and it contains a link to a malicious website, and they click on that link and end up giving away some credentials or some information that's important. We do these phishing simulations in these organizations where we send emails to people with links like that, but they don't go to a malicious website. They go to an internal website that probably explains that you've just gone onto you've just clicked a link that you shouldn't have clicked on. Now, we send these phishing simulation emails out all the time. That's not training. That is just trying to catch fish.
Yeah.
But we're not really developing that ability to teach people what I quite often click on like those emails, and I report them, and I get a message back saying, "Well done, you've just reported a phishing simulation." What have I learned from that? I've learned nothing.
No.
Tick the box. And what about those people that are opening emails all the time to open up documents or click on links because that's how they're interfacing with suppliers or customers? How do you tell them not to click on a link? Are they meant to check every single one to make sure that it is absolutely valid before they open it? Or do we need to develop a system that allows them to click on these links and do it safely every time.
Yeah.
There's another way, and the only way you're going to do that is by building that resilience into your organization. It's not by training people not to click on links. Like
Yes,
an email.
and I think this is where that compliance thing we were talking about earlier, and it's almost like we just don't want people to think. We just sort of want them to, just not do something without them understanding it. We had even in my business, small one, we had an issue with that, and someone clicked on something. It wasn't an issue because we sorted it out. It was relatively, small. It wasn't a big drama. But after that, it was more like it was giving people the confidence to have a look and go, well, I'm not sure about this. And, you say something, and it's quite obvious when you teach people around what you're looking for. How do you know that this is like a potential phishing thing? Oh, because it's meant to be from this organisation, but the prefix of the thing is .org, not .co.uk, which I'm normally used to. And it's just trying to get people thinking in that sense, rather than I think we put a lot of fear into people and about don't click this, or the world's going to fall apart.
Or when someone does click on a link, they feel that fear of actually telling someone that they've done it,
Yes.
and they've entered, especially if they've gone as far as entering their username password into a hacker's website. They'll keep that quiet. Oh no, I don't want to tell anybody, and that's wrong as well. We need to build that psychological safety into the system, so that basically someone can say, "I've just done this, and I think I made a real bit of a mess up," and that person not feel that they're going to be fired for doing that. It's actually an opportunity to learn from this experience and understand, okay, what can we do better? Or, okay, someone's now clicked on this link, they've given in their credentials. What does that mean to the business? What does that mean to the individual as well? Because it could also be quite significant for the individual. But what can we do to limit the risk now that this has actually happened, as opposed to someone clicking on the link and being very quiet and all hell breaks loose because no one wants to speak up about what they've done.
No, and that's the thing around with a lot of this, and a part of resilience as well is that initiative. The sooner you sooner you can take the initiative away from the hacker, because your speed, but you're not going to get that. Well, I think they're two interlinked. One, if you don't have the resilience and people aren't ready to adapt to those situations and roughly know what they could do, and two, if people aren't going to tell you, then you can't seize that initiative, and you're always going to be on the back foot, and that's not where you want to be as an organisation. You want to be able to understand there's something wrong and seize that initiative really quickly, so that you can minimise the risk that you've got.
Yeah, I dare I say it, but it's in my head I've got the OODA loop.
Yes,
And
exactly.
The attackers are trying to disrupt your orientation. You need to reverse that and try to disrupt the attacker's orientation.
Yeah,
and I think that's probably the way you look at that.
And all this stuff we're talking about with this practice around red team or outcome-based learning, making yourself adaptable, having the right sort of frameworks in place that aren't too restrictive, giving people the space to make decisions, that all helps the orientation phase. So it enables that quickness or speed from observation to orientation, to make those quick decisions, to act, and then constantly adapting to how that's unfolding. I think that's really closely aligned to OODA loop. You
definitely.
use it so much. I love the OODA loop. I can go on about it all the time.
I do know. I think I mentioned to you previously that 5 or 6 years ago I got the wrong end of the stick of the OODA loop. I think I saw one of those linear circles of the OODA loop, and then I got introduced to John Boyd's OODA sketch. Let's call it a sketch. It's not a loop, it's a sketch. And then listening to people like Brian McGrath, one of your previous guests, like realizing that John Boyd actually had a really deep understanding of businesses, studied the Toyota production system. He had studied the way that businesses work. A lot of people think it's just his fighter pilot instinct coming out. It wasn't anything like that at all. He was a non-academic academic. He studied this stuff in depth, and his OODA loop was the outcome of that. If anyone's listening, just go and check that out, because that podcast out, because it's a good one that you do with Mike McGrath there.
And I think it's really useful, definitely everything we're talking about with strategy and cybersecurity, and actually there's so much commonality being the challenges we have. It's all about protecting that ability to think in that decision space, rather than trying to restrict it, which is often counterintuitive to what people are taught. It's not just in cyber world, it's in in leadership, governance, all this. It's how do we restrict decision space? Because if we restrict decision space, then there's going to be less risks, but we know that not to be true. and actually it creates more bureaucracy, more inertia, and it prevents you from adapting to those situations.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it really does.
How have you? So you said you're looking at this stuff for your masters. What sort of the key things that you've talked about in a more systemic view of this stuff?
Yeah, so what I'm looking at really is vulnerability management. We have a challenge in cybersecurity that we talked about as technical debt that could manifest in like a huge database of vulnerabilities that we have within our own software. And we've tried this systematic way of dealing with this. You know, we often hear about, okay, how do we prioritize? There's different ways of prioritizing. We have like CVSS scores, we have EPSS scores, we have KEV scores. We try to prioritize on that, but these are just different ways of dealing with the same systematic way of dealing with it. And what I'm trying to say is maybe there's a systemic way that can support us as well. You know, like, and I'm looking at the viable system model by Stafford Beer, VSM. You know, how do we build a viable vulnerability management system? And using the model that Stafford Beer came up with to try and do that. And so my dissertation is exploring that area. So, you know, how do we get the right communication channels? You know, what, not just between the systems, but between the different layers of the systems as well. What does governance look like? You know, how does the System 3, System 4's homeostasis look like in the vulnerability management? You know, System 4 looking at the future and outward threats, and System 3 looking at the inward and now developments that we're doing, and you know, the communication between those as well. So I'm trying to work out how that looks, and whether there's something there that we can learn from. So aligning systemic and systematic ways of doing stuff.
Yeah, I can imagine how System 2 could play a lot into that around the coordination between the different elements from sort of the DevOps and so on, and different teams. Be useful. Yeah, that sounds really, really good. And it's so good that you can use these sort of methodologies to look at a different lens in the organization and go, well, you know, what do we need to do? What's our capabilities now? Do we then look after that? Sorry, you could.
I was just going to say, you know, so something that I've already identified that could be missing is identity on that System 5. You know, you know, what does, you know, identity in terms of vulnerability management as a system? You know, how do we build that policy around vulnerability management? We build policies around lots of different things around the circumference of it, but it doesn't really have its own identity. So we have like policies around scanning code. We have policies around time to fix code, you know, stuff like that. But there's no real policy that is overarching within that system. So you think of a system being so Stafford Beer's systems are fractal. They're recursive. So you know, I'm looking at this model here, this particular system here, and then you've got other systems that build around it. You've got other systems that do seem to have their own identity, but vulnerability management itself, this is based on my research, obviously. I would probably recommend that people explore it a bit further in their own context, but that's something which I've found so far.
I assume that that's similar into organization. I think there's a bit of us where it's almost just assumed. So it's like there's nothing. Oh, it's like execution. It's just assumed that we make strategy and we execute it, rather than thinking, no, there should be it sounds counterintuitive to what we've been talking about, but enough coherence or structure around what we're doing to help guide by principles. In a sense, we're not on about rules. It's all about guiding principles to enable people to do this stuff. Because if you do that, that gives them sufficient cognitive framework to be able to adapt from, rather than when there's nothing, like you probably found, there's no identity around it. It then has a real risk of fracturing, because you get divergence of action. You get divergence of action, and people are doing all different things, which then makes you more vulnerable, or just as vulnerable if everything was so tightly governed that you could adapt. So it's about having that boundary between, too rigid and too chaotic. It's that bit of stability in the middle that you're trying to tightrope.
Yeah, definitely. So it's been an interesting year and a bit studying this. So, it's certainly given an appetite for drilling more into systemic ways of dealing with security.
Yeah, and when you're thinking about this stuff as well, and the same in execution we're just talking about, is that with that vulnerability management and the security there, same with execution, I need people. And if my people aren't engaged or have a good level of commitment towards the organization, i.e. if I treat my people pretty bad, I treat them like idiots. I don't give them the resources that they need to do the job. I put massive strains on them, like you saw with the DevOps, you were talking about with the DevOps people, really time pressured, then that's going to potentially increase what we call counter work behaviors. So in the execution world, in the counter work behaviors, is that people come a bit despondent. They will put barriers up and to execution. Where I suppose in this cyber world, correct me, but that counter work behaviors can start looking to that insider threat. Actually, people actively looking for malicious ways to bring down the system.
Yeah, definitely. As it Deming, you said, everyone's entitled to have pride in their work, and if we take that away from people are not proud in their work. Don't have that pride in their work. Then they're not really developing something that they really love and feel that they'd be happy about. And that's where the problems occur. So yeah, I think there's a learning there that you probably do need to give the developers a freedom to actually enjoy what they're doing, enjoy their code, enjoy the development process, do it in the right way, so they can actually say, do you know what, I've written some really secure stuff, and I'm really proud of that.
Yeah. And I think that's like you said, that word enjoy, and I totally resonate with it. I think it's really important that people enjoy in their pride. I just think that word enjoyment gets captured in a different corporate way, and enjoyment becomes, how do we create all these other initiatives? I always joke, about tabletop yoga and all this other crap, but all that does then is it reduces that capacity that people have. It takes them away from what they want to do, and then it puts more pressure on them, which then decreases their enjoyment. So it's interesting to see how different people's perspective on enjoyment can actually have a counter effect. Yeah. But I totally resonate with that enjoyment. If you get that, that's fantastic.
And one of the principles of DevOps, actually, there's 5 principles of DevOps. One of them is focus, flow, and joy. So DevOps is as written by Gene Kim and Jez Humble, and I can't remember who the third author was, but that's basically what they talk about, is focus, flow, and joy.
Oh, that's cool. I wonder if they mean flow as in me high cheek sent me highs.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly where Gene Kim got his influence. He's influenced by him. Yeah, I can never pronounce his name, but yeah.
All right. Yeah, it took me a while to learn his name.
Yeah,
he appears quite a lot in stuff I talk about. I had to learn how to say his name, so I went and got it into Google, and it broke it down to and I listened to other people say it. Yeah, so it's me high, cheek sent me high.
Okay. Take your word for it.
If listeners, he's wrote a book called Flow, and it's all about that idea. And really, if you want to boil it down to its very simplest simplest part of his concept, is that if you ever felt you're in that moment where you're so engrossed in what you're doing that you've just lost track of time. And that's really what we're saying about flow. And you only get flow if you've got, the right resources, you've got clarity, you're talking about commander's intent, you've got the support, and you generally enjoy the task. You get those things, you get flow. And that means people just so engrossed, so in tune to it, but then they get a sense of enjoyment. I like that word, enjoyment into what they're doing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Deming did actually say everyone's entitled to joy at work.
Yeah, I agree. We spend a lot of time there.
Yeah, he definitely do.
Cool. I thought it was fascinating with this concept of bringing those two worlds together around cyber and strategy, and how actually there's very similar commonalities of challenges that we have. But for our listeners, Glenn, is there something you want to leave our listeners to think about or reflect from about this episode?
Yeah, I guess what I would say to people is learn to enjoy your work, and and I think if you're a leader, build that capacity into your organization, because if you don't build that capacity, you'd be too prescriptive. You're telling your developers what to do, your staff what to do. You're just not going to build that ability to remain secure. Security comes from being creative, and you need to be able to build that creativity into your teams to learn how to write good secure code and not build up technical debt, and to be proud of what they're delivering. So I guess that's my key takeaway there, really.
Yeah. I like that idea of technical debt, and and I think that's very relevant outside of cybersecurity. It's just that debt of things that we enable to happen in our organisation that are probably going to constrain us or create further risk in the future. So I think that's really
Yes.
good. And your idea of, giving that space, that ability for people to act, I think is crucial in an organisation, especially this more dynamic environment that we find ourselves in. Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, Glenn.
Oh, no,
I
I've really
appreciate
enjoyed
that.
this.
No, it's
Thank
good.
you.
No, it's fantastic. And for people that are listening, if you enjoyed this conversation as much as I have, then please like and subscribe and share to your network so they can get value from this. Yeah, and I look forward to another conversation next week. So thank you very much, Glenn. I look
Well,
forward to speaking to you again soon.
thank you, Mike. See you soon.
See you soon.